Hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Welcome. My name is Bonnie Brzezowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. I'm here to welcome you to the third and final event in the 2025 Champenoufou series. The title of tonight's presentation is Indigenous Placekeeping Through Tarweed. If you don't know, the first event in our series was in October, and it was actually held in person at Prax. It focused on the future of Indigenous foods in the Kalapuya homeland. And if you'd like to watch the video of that event, I'm going to share that with you in the chat. So there that is, if you'd like to take a look. We also did the second event in our series. That one was held virtually in November, and it was about Indigenous placekeeping through tea, presented by David Harrelson. I'm going to share the recording of that one as well in the chat, so you can take a look at it if you'd like. There it is. You may also watch videos from previous years of the Champenoufou series at yet another link that I'm going to share in the chat. This is the entire playlist there. So it includes the two videos that I just shared with you. So if you just want them all, this is the one link. So as I'm sure you've probably already noticed, we're using Zoom tonight. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We're going to try to answer those at the end. You usually click or tap on the question mark to submit your questions, though every device is different. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand it over now to Dave Eckert, the program chair for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club. He's going to tell us more about the series and introduce our presenters tonight.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Let's see.
thank you.
Let's see. Okay. All right. Welcome to the Champenoufou series. That has been going on since 2017. And again, Champenoufou is the land of the people of the Pinafou or Mary's River, and essentially in Benton County. And the purpose of this is to build understanding and relationships with Confederated tribes, the Grand Ronde and Siletz Indians, and all indigenous people in the area. Just want to let you know that all the programs are, well, let me just say, the Confederated tribes of the Grand Ronde selects all the presentation subjects and selects all the presenters. And that's done by David Harrelson, who I just showed you a minute ago, and you'll see in a few minutes. The initial and continuing co-sponsor has been the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club, and was joined that very first year in 2017 by the Spring Creek Project, a part of OSU. And then joined later by the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library to provide technical support for us. And a little bit, and about the same year, the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition came in as a funding co-sponsor. And also our final one is the School of Language, Culture, and Society with Oregon State University. So we're grateful that all these co-sponsors make this happen. And without, now the way we run it, without any one of them, we would have a hard time existing. So let's all give our appreciation to them. Why is tarweed becoming such a buzzword in Corvallis and Benton County? Well, it could go all the way back to the turn of the century, about when Judy Johnson was writing her book, The World of the Kalapuya, and she provided a whole page on William Hartless, also known as Shawala. And that's the name for little tarweed. And she also recommended that a city park being along Mary's River be named for Shalawa, and the city followed through with that and chose the confluence point of the Marys and the Willamette River. And the fact that she really brought Shalawa to the awareness of the whole community has been really the start of the buzzword for tarweed. When David Harrelson gave his speech or his talk at the Lamprey Creek Awakening, when it was the honor of we're honoring the naming of that creek in 2016. He talked about Shalwell or William Heartless, and that was probably the first um, presentation that I'm aware of that was publicly made in this area in its current century. And there was all of a sudden a great awareness about him and his relation to tarweed. Also, Gabe Sheaships that same year was this graduate student into some local history research on Shalawa and the tarweed connection here in Corvallis, and that gave it another boost. And and uh, in 2020, Fred Prahl planted some tarweed, particularly the Mattia elegans, as shown here, in the Bald Hill Natural Area, and that gave it another boost. And Grand Run linguist Fred Schrock, about the same time, really turned his attention to the linguistic study of Shalawa and Shawal and Ashawal and all the variations on the word tarweed, and shared that with us in Corvallis. But the biggest boost that came was when Rose Holdorf decided, recommended the name Tarweed for the new folk school that was coming here and is now in full swing here, the Tarweed Folk School. And all of a sudden, everybody was talking about Tarweed. The foundation had been laid before 2023, but that's when it really took off. And then we had the Tarweed Awakening Corvallis, which is now going to be an annual program, celebration. We had one this year, and the second annual one will be on August 22nd, 2026, and it's going to be quite a development from the first one. We learned a lot, and it's going to be pretty exciting. We have a lot more co-sponsors now who are doing programs, so that'll be exciting. Now, for some reason, at the same time, everybody's starting to notice the coastal tarweed throughout our natural areas around Corvallis. Now, were they always there? And nobody noticed them, or did they suddenly appear? I think it's the former. I think they've always been there and just nobody noticed them, but everybody's noticing primarily the Mattia sativa, the coastal tarweed in this picture. And it's just all over the place now. And so tonight, the talk, as Bonnie said, is on tarweed and the Kalapuya Placekeeping, and we're so honored to have Molly Carney and David Harrelson here. Molly's given a talk on last year on cultivating camas, so you can look that up on the library website. David's been at all of the 9 years of the Championship series and every single one, and he's going to be talking. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and then he will be introducing Molly. So take it away, David. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave Eckert. Molly and I are really excited to join you. Molly Carney is a professor at Oregon State University, and we've had the opportunity to work together even when Molly was working on her PhD out of Washington State University. And we've continued to be able to collaborate on different projects. I think what Molly and I want to make sure that you all know is that we're going to talk about tarweed tonight, but we're not really experts about tarweed, you see. But we needed somebody to talk about tarweed, so we've decided to team up on it. Admittedly, I thought I was going to get a master's degree focused on archaeology and tarweed, but inevitably that never materialized because in 2016, about the time that the Chimpinafu series started, I became the department manager at Grand Round, which didn't really leave much time to go get a master's degree on tarweed. But I was drawn to a lot of attractive things about tarweed, which are still relevant, and I hope to be able to share those. And it's always kind of been a curiosity and something that I track. we are going to share the stage today. So we're going to pass it back and forth, and maybe I'll turn it over to Molly if you want to say any opening remarks as I get our slide deck set up.
Thank you so much for that gracious warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you all. Yes, we're going to have a bit of a conversation, and we're excited to continue that conversation. Hopefully, this will be an inspiration for everyone to really start thinking a little bit more closely about tarweed. And I think we'll have more questions maybe than answers today. But I also just wanted to say thanks too for the warm welcome. It's been really phenomenal to get to work with both David Harrelson, Dave Eckert, and even though I've only been in Corvallis for a couple of years, I feel like I've really been able to establish relationships with folks for many years prior to that, and it was such a smooth transition. I'm so happy to really be here and to get to work with you all. So thank you also for joining us on this cold December night.
Wonderful. Talking about beautiful yellow flowers on a cold, dark night sounds like a good thing to do. We'll also talk about the other parts of the plant. So Dave did a great job of kind of giving a basic intro and some of the background, which we'll revisit some of those things about tarweed. But for those of you that have never heard the term placekeeping, what's placekeeping? And what I wanted to share is a definition of indigenous placekeeping, a form of engagement that prioritizes ecological, historical, and cultural relationships to place while bringing the presence of indigenous histories and futures into focus. Right? So that example of the work that Judy did, saying, hey, there's this guy who was born, at the encampment in the town of Corvallis right before removal to the reservations, and his nickname was Little Tarweed. And if we're going to name a park after something, we should consider that name, right? That's indigenous placekeeping. So it doesn't mean that like a native person has to do it, right? But it's like in honor of, ecological, historical, and cultural relationships to place. And they bring those like indigenous futures like present and forward. There's also some other terms, just placekeeping in general. There's a, excuse me, a nonprofit called the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and they define placekeeping as the active care and maintenance of a place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there. It is not just preserving buildings, but the ability of local people to maintain their way of life as they choose. And this term placekeeping is often a response to the term placemaking, which maybe we've heard a lot more as a part of like planning efforts and others, which is this, placemaking is the idea that we make place anew and we make it better. That's sort of the optimistic side of it. The downside of it is oftentimes it results in sort of displacement of people and gentrification of neighborhoods and sort of, a break with the new. But we put forward this idea of placekeeping as this way to really think back in time and depths of time and the things that are useful from the past, like bringing those forward. And so celebrating this immensely abundant plant that is great for, all different types of species, including humans, but a lot of humans haven't been using it lately in the area. And so maybe we can suggest a potential for a future where we're growing tarweed and it's a part of their diet, or it gets used by bakeries, or it does other things. That's sort of aspirational. William Hartless. So William Hartless is a Grand Round Indian. He's Ampinafu Kalapuya. And there were two children, babies, that were, less than 1 year old when they were removed to the reservation in Grand Round. Excuse me, that came from the Corvallis area. And William Hartless was one of those people. So it's believed that he was born in 1855, 1856. And his nickname, he had a number of nicknames, not just Shalawa, Little Tarweed. He also had a nickname, Futi. And there's a whole presentation about William Hartless. But one of the things is that in the 1920s, he was interviewed, maybe not the 1920s, before that, he was interviewed by anthropologists, and he told a number of creation stories, and the primary account of the flood story that we talk about, filling the Willamette Valley with 400 feet of water, and the oldest memory to a geological event that we have as a people, was actually told by William Hartless. And there's a section of that story, and in the story, he actually even mentions tar weeds. And so I thought I would just read a passage out of this. It's from the Kalapuya texts. It's the story of the Whale People, Panther, and Flint. You can find it on page 251 and 252 if you really want to go looking for it to backtrack that. But Panther and Flint lived together. Panther used to hunt. Flint stayed all the time at the house. Flint's work was at the house. He gathered tar weeds and he dug camas, and he gathered hazelnuts and he gathered acorns, and he speared fish. That was his work, and he gathered firewood too. Now the woman worked. She mashed tar weeds. Her grinding was good. It was finely ground meal. Then she broke out a single one of her hairs. She folded, rolled it up, and she put it there in the panther's serving of tar weed. Now Panther got there at night. He brought back 5 deer. Then they ate, and Panther ate the tar weeds. He found a hare. It was a long hair. He looked at Flint. He still had his hair, but there were only 5 hairs left on him. Now Panther said in his heart, he has been keeping a woman. That bad thing, that rascally fellow. Again, indeed, as they ate, the woman peeked out. Again, Panther choked. Panther said, I have constantly told you not to look at me. Flint said, oh, I forgot. And this is just to illustrate that, these plants, they not only are a part of cultural practices and livelihoods, but they even like accounts and these subtle references about utilization and how these plants are used, like they show up in the actual creation stories of the people of this place. Can I pass it over to you, Molly?
Sure. So what you might be asking at this point, what is tarweed? What is this plant that we keep talking about? So tarweed is an annual plant. It is an aromatic plant, and it has very distinctive yellow flowers that some consider to be kind of hairy. It is part of the broader sunflower family. There are several species and subspecies within the Medea genus. There are also a couple other related genera close within this tribe in the plant botanical taxonomic sense. So all of the Medea species, though, are native to either Western North America or Southwestern South America. And it is even hypothesized in some places that this region might be one of the origins for the genus because there's such a great, amazing amount of diversity within and between species here. So the name tarweed too, it's a common name. It really comes from its aroma or scent, its intense stickiness. I kind of wish I had a photo too of what my hands look like after I've worked with tarweed too. It's pretty stark and dark and sticky. Now, there are many different species of Medea. There are at least 6 which grow within Oregon, primarily across the Willamette Valley and the Blue Mountains. So we've already referenced 2 of the most common that we're probably familiar with. So Medea sativa, which grows primarily in Western Oregon and coastal lowland areas, and Medea elegans, elegant tarweed too, which is primarily found again in Western Oregon. There are a couple other species too. Gracilis, which is all across Oregon, Glomerata, which isn't quite as productive, but also really found pretty all over the place, and a couple other species in more select areas throughout the state itself. So tarweed too, it's a fantastic pollinator species because it has a very long bloom period from June to late summer. It's interesting though because the flowers they close in the late morning and they reopen later in the afternoon, and this is to conserve water. So I have a great photo. I called it napping, but you can also think of it as like a siesta, right? And so the plant itself takes these siestas, which is really great for native bees and their foraging patterns and the ways they like to move and eat, but it's actually not so great for honeybees. Now, this plant itself too also produces abundant oily seeds, which are used as foods for many birds and many small animals. And so, like David mentioned, this particular plant is really favored and supports many different species. You can commonly find tarweed once you start looking for it across dry prairies, fields, along disturbed areas, roadsides, clearings, really well draining and pretty frequently disturbed places. So these flowers really love and thrive from interaction. So we actually call plants such as tarweeds like early succession plants themselves too. Would you like to add anything, David?
I'm gonna jump back. I realized I put names on this slide and I didn't say
Yeah.
them, which is there's a few native names for tarweed just locally. We have Salawa, like little tarweed, like the nickname for William Hartless. In Chinukwawa, the trade language, it's referred to as sapaflil, and in Northern Kalapuya dialects, it's referred to as a tuk, A-T-U-K. Um, I think that that's interesting. The other part is sapaflil. It's it's really referring to like prairie seeds, and so when you have this in the historic record, like if people are referencing sapaflil, they're probably referencing tarweed because it's the most abundant prairie seed. But there's other prairie seeds that are edible that are like in the diet. And the idea when you're out there gathering, as we're going to talk about, it's not like people are necessarily being fully discriminate about what edible seeds they're choosing to eat and how those things get ground up. And so Clarkia species, a number of other things like end up in seed mixes, and it's something that like we know from cultural practice. So that sort of comes in if we're looking for that in archaeological expressions, like the idea of, more of like your multi-grain seed bread, instead of sesame seed bun or something like that specific. So just keep that in mind. Yeah. Are you ready for the next slide?
Sure.
Okay.
Um, Thank you. And so I just had a little bit more to cover on fire and succession too, but I hope we can come back to this idea of Clarkia and some of those other species when we start talking about the archaeology. So after disturbances such as fire is the most common type of disturbance, there are other types of land clearing. We within ecology and botany think about different succession stages of different plant communities, so just different species that all live together. And so when we think about early successional plant communities, these are plant communities with fast growing, like usually annual species that really rapidly grow into open sites with minimal competition and high resource availability. So I have on here an older diagram just to show you what this looks like, but I'd love to someday redraw it with Willamette Valley species themselves and change out some of the words and phrases a little bit. So some of these plant communities, some of these early successional plant communities will often include species like tarweed, also goosefoot or clarkia, or some of these other annual CD type plants, as well as annual grasses, and they really work to stabilize some of our disturbed soils, and they actually modify like microsite conditions too. So actually work to reduce temperature extremes and increase soil moisture retention, which really facilitates the establishment of later successional perennial species. And so if it's left unmanaged, the ecosystem too, eventually you will see some of these larger woodlands and forests fill into spaces. But in fire adapted ecosystems and in places where people are an intrinsic part of the landscape using anthropogenic or cultural fire, periodic burning actually really works to reset succession to some of these early stages, which really maintains open conditions that tarweed or other species really, really love and thrive in. So this is why we call tarweed one of those species that really loves to live in disturbed places. So on the next slide, I have a photo of some of the gradients actually within our homeland. So this is actually from farther to the south in the Willamette Valley, but I like it because you can see right in the foreground an upland prairie. And as you go up the hill, this transition to oak, savanna, woodland to coniferous forest. And if you can imagine, if you're looking up a hill behind you, we would have a lowland prairie too. So this is that really seasonally wet type of prairie. Now, these upland prairies, though, and these oak savannas, they're really grassland systems that are endemic to the Willamette Valley and a couple other places throughout the Northwest. And so these places too are really phenomenal, and we know historically too are really maintained by frequent anthropogenic burning. And so tarweed is found in many of these upland prairie places, again, really reliant on people for its own ways of living. And we'll come back to that thought a little bit more again later. Did you have anything else you'd like to add here?
I love that you put in a picture of Mount Pisgah because it's a place that I've burned before. But also it was the one place where we partnered with their native plant nursery to do a test plot of 100 foot by 20 foot test bed where we spaced plants out. Ultimately, Hal Hushback, who no longer works there, he retired from his retired job, which was his retired job at the time. But Hal did a number of test plots and found that in smaller test plots in earlier years, and found that really the optimal spacing was about 12 inches on center for all the plants. And the value of that is that he found in his plots where he planted, and really you're thinning because all that seed just shatters, right, when you spread it. And it's really prolific, and you'll get, dozens of starts per 12 by 12 inch square, and you're essentially going in and thinning them out and then putting one back in the ground every 12 inches. But when he did it tighter than 12 inches, the plants were so thick that it became like nesting habitat for like rabbits and squirrels, and then they were like matting it down and sort of creating disturbance in the bed. And when it was larger than that, the plants didn't have enough space, or they had too much space to actually adequately support each other, and so the wind would blow over these plants. And he had really fertile soil. He was growing tarweed plants that got to be 5 foot tall. They were absolutely
Wow.
massive.
Wow.
Yeah, really huge. And but it was off that 100 by 20 foot plot. He produced 55 gallons of seed, which his harvesting technique, which we had gone down and helped, was just to cut at the base, take it over onto a tarp and shake it onto the tarp and hope as little as possible sticks onto all the plants, right? So you're probably still only getting about half the seed. And that was used for restoration basically at Pisgah. And then around 10 pounds of the seed was gifted to the tribe that we used for different cultural events and other activities. But Mount Pisgah, is a place in the valley where kind of that early work around tarweed that was motivating me to be like, hey, we should do something about this. I should go get my degree. It started at Pisgah.
Wow, that's incredible. I'll have to ask you more questions about that
Yeah.
at another point in time.
Any ones you think other people would be interested in right now, or is that a deeper story for later? Yeah.
Maybe a deeper story for
Okay.
later.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I've tried to recreate it a couple of times since then. Not as successful. Mainly, I haven't had rich soils to try to grow it in. I've had challenges with elk overrunning my plots, and a number of maintenance people mowing down my plots. Anyways, all types of fun. So at any scale, I haven't been able to effectively pull it off. Only areas that I've been able to grow and manage patches is very small in more recent years. But there is some more active patches around Grand Round that are being cared for in not as official of like a native nursery sort of environment, but a little bit more wild around the community, which is good to see. That's what I got. I'll pass it back to you for the sticky picture.
Well, that's incredible. Well, one other element too to thinking about tarweed is the tar in the name, right? So, and I'm sure we could share stories about actually working with tarweed. So the plants themselves, they're actually covered in, as you can see in this photo, really tiny hair-like structures called trichomes. And so some of these trichomes actually have little droplets. So these are glandular trichomes. And so this is where we're actually getting the tar. So for a long time, for years, people didn't quite understand what was the evolutionary purpose of the tar. And we'll talk and share a little bit more about some of the cultural ways people have worked with the tar itself. But scientists thought that maybe the stickier plants, the ones with more resin or tar, would actually work to deter herbivores, so like bugs and other critters who liked tarweed pollen and seeds. And so a really recent study actually found that tarweed plants produce lots of this tar in greater volumes. It doesn't actually prevent like caterpillars or other aphids from eating them. They also found too that there's more variation of the like volume of tar that's produced within one particular species than if you compare across species too. So they're having a really hard time tracking where these traits come from evolutionarily speaking. So this is pretty cool because it suggests that these glandular trichomes, they evolved for some other reason. And so they hypothesize it might be to deal with drought or heat or as a sort of like indirect defense mechanism. So even potentially attracting and trapping predators, and other bugs that would then come and eat the bugs. So this is like a way of indirectly deterring any potential predators rather than like directly stopping herbivores. There's some other really cool and interesting elements as well, too. So I found that there's two ecotypes of Medea elegans. And so there's an early season ecotype, which actually has a low density of the trichomes, and it tends to be more resistant to just like general damage by bugs because they flower earlier. Then there's a late season ecotype, which actually produces quite a bit of tar, much more volume, and which actually traps more insects too. And so this, what we call plasticity in flowering time and the volume of tar that these plants produce is actually pretty cool because it allows the like this particular species, and we think maybe the genus as a whole, to really adapt to aridity, to climate change, to shifts in pollinators, to predators or herbivores. And I would challenge everyone here too to think about ways that people may have been directly or indirectly influencing some of these different ecotypes or the traits that we see now in many of these plants. And so, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I'll say is that tariness actually landed tarweed on a lot of eradication lists and wasn't being placed in restoration seed mixes for many, many years. And that was because when people raise livestock and the livestock get into the tarweed and it's growing in areas, the tar gets on their fur and then they lay down in the dirt and it basically creates matting and just like a complete mess of your animals and like they need to clean things. And so as you know, the shift of there is this a little bit of a tension between tarweed in your fields and raising animals and animal husbandry. Like it's not a desirable thing. And so it took some time to be able to demonstrate the restoration qualities and the other environmental benefits. But it should be noted that, you know, if you're raising livestock or your neighbors are, they probably don't like this plant. But there were a lot of choices of selection against tarweed as the landscape of Champinafu transformed, right, through settlement and fencing and other sorts of actions. Uh,
In the next couple slides, we have just a couple photos. We have a couple photos to share with you about common species that we've already talked about and that you might be more likely to encounter too around what is now Corvallis. So most photos, if anyone is showing you a photo about tarweed, are actually elegant tarweed because it is so beautiful. And some elegant tarweed plants will actually have a gorgeous little red petal arrangement as well too. That's a little bit more visible. Now, elegant tarweed is native to Western North America from South Central Washington all the way down to northern Baja California. So it's usually found in slightly drier locations as well as disturbed areas and grasslands from low to high elevations. So I've seen a lot of reference to unpublished works too that note that this species is highly variable in its morphology, its ecology, and even when it flowers. What would you like to add, David?
yeah, so the pictures that you're looking at is a picture of a patch that Natural Resources Native Plant Nursery and I grew a number of years ago now. And then in the lower right-hand corner is something referred to as a seed fan or a seed beater. And this was actually a seed fan that was collected on the Grand Round Indian Reservation in the 1870s and ended up at the British Museum. And it was something that in 2018 we actually received 16 items from this collection, including this item that were on loan. And we selected the items that we wanted to recreate. And so this item was recreated. And if you were able to be at the Tarweed Awakening this last summer, you would have seen Chris Rempel, who was one of the individuals that recreated a seed fan from that British Museum seed fan. Above that is the artistic rendition mock-up of an association that will be cast in concrete as a relief on the Van Buren Bridge when it's completed. And one of the really exciting things about that historic bridge being renovated and done is there was these ideas of embellishments on the blocks. And so they approached it with this idea of placekeeping and asked the tribe about different important cultural plants, but then also objects that were related to those plants. So at the bottom panel, you have a seed fan, and those are sort of artistic representations of seeds. And then above is this idea of a tarweed flower. And so I think there's something 20 plus, maybe nearly 30 different cultural foods, plants, and their associations. And if you walk along the Van Buren Bridge when it's completed, you'll be able to see those as relief concrete castings. And I'm pretty excited about that as a future Corvallis area placekeeping action.
That is so cool. There's so many reasons why I'm excited for that bridge to be finished. And that's number one.
Well, yeah, other people, transit, getting through things will probably make it a lot easier too for everybody.
On the next slide, we have a little bit about Medea sativa. So coastal, sometimes referred to as Chilean tarweed too, is also native to the Americas. So it's actually distributed in two different areas. So the west coast of North America, from Alaska and British Columbia, all the way again down to Baja California. And then it's split. So in South America, at the far southern portion of South America, in Chile and Argentina. And so this is called a geographic disjunction, excuse me. It's hypothesized that this might be due to bird dispersal, but we really don't know why it's split quite like this.
One thing of note is that in the historical records within Spanish record sets, Medea sativa is referred to in its earliest iterations as Medea viscosa, as viscous, and it's because the indigenous people down in Chile were noted as making and pressing oil from the plant. And one of the ways that that's interesting is that there's like an 1845 pre-Civil War U.S. Senate committee report that I found that talked about the economic prospects of Medea viscosa in the American agricultural system. And it was a summary report that talked about this little known plant, Medea viscosa, being imported to Spain in the 1500s from Chile and grown sort of relatively quietly in Spain and France for over 200 years, roughly is described as like an olive oil knockoff, or a seed oil that was being blended with olive oil and other actions. But Medea sativa is a plant that has not only been an agricultural crop to indigenous people in South America, an important cultural species in Western America, but even a European crop that was managed for a number of years. But to date, I don't know of it being a crop actively, like as a cash crop anywhere in the world. And I don't know why that is.
I don't either, because it has in the 90s, so like 140 years after that particular incident, right? It was actually re-explored too. And so I think that they tried to look at like high oil content. It was 26 to 31% oil. Also has a high protein content, and it can be pretty adaptable to different soils. And so again, it's agricultural potential has been explored but never really, and maybe it's a good thing too that it hasn't really been exploited in an agricultural industrialized setting, and so that we can re-explore relationships a little bit more slowly and thoughtfully.
Yeah, I would agree. Uh, Medea sativa. Oh, these are winnowing trays. These are also winnowing trays that are part of the Summers collection that's housed at the British Museum that were collected in the 1870s from Grand Round. One of the parts, when you harvest this plant, you take that seed fan and you hit the heads, and the seeds fall off. And then, do we have a chalb? Gosh. Yeah,
I think
there's
we
a
do.
chalb on the next slide. Let me get there. Oh, too many slides open. Oh, did we get there? Are you all looking at what I'm looking at?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is an ash bark tray on the right. And the thing about an ash bark tray is that it works better than anything else, including nonstick pans. Through my own process of trying to recreate uh, the this, you need to parch the seeds because ideally you want to get the husk off of the seed, and to do that you need to like roast or toast them. And the very first thing I tried, of course, was like, oh, I'll do it like seeds, right? Or spices when you cook them and roast them. And the problem with that is that when it would toast, the seed would pop open, but then there's like sticky resin and the whole thing would just kind of stick together as a ball. But if you do it on an ash bark tray, and the way that you do that is you heat little stones or coals in a fire, and then you get your seeds all in your ash bark tray, and you put that hot stone or the coals actually physically on the seeds, and then you toss it around. And when the coal touches it, it basically pops and pops the seed out of the husk. But the ash bark is more receptive to the sticky resin than the seeds and the chaff, and so it separates that resin from your seeds and your chaff, and then you can dump it into a winnowing tray that allows you to kind of throw it up in the wind and more or less like gold panning, right? The heavier stuff, the seed stays on the bottom, the chaff blows away, and you sort of winnow things down until you get clean seed. And so that's how you would traditionally clean your seed.
And then once you had your seeds cleaned too, according to the Calipoya text, you could grind it and you could store it for a very long time as well too, right? You could store it en masse for over winter, correct?
Yeah.
Um,
So, and in the upper left-hand corner, you have seeds that have been partially winnowed, but you still see some chaff in there, like the chaff or like the white, like little plant parts that aren't the seed. Um, that's sort of what you're looking at. Or sorry, this is before, this has the husk on it. So this is before you would pop the seeds open and then winnow further. In this case, I was winnowing before because you have all these loose plant parts on your seeds. So you have to like winnow and separate all of your like plant parts and bugs and all the other stuff that ends up in your bucket. And then, so there's two phases of winnowing. I didn't describe the first one, but yeah.
and then as far as I understand too, now at the time too, it could be ground into like a meal using mortars and pestles. So I have an archaeological example in here. I've seen it referenced that it might have been mixed with cooked camas and hazelnuts. But what are some of the other culinary experiments that you've engaged in?
Yeah, so that's a part of the reason why it gets referred to as sapoflo, which is basically like a bread, right? And bread is sort of a liberal term, like a cake, right? So we have these things where you process different ingredients down, you grind them up, and then you make them in sort of like patties and like put them on a hot rock, and they cook or they dry out. And then those, once they're dried, can be stored for an extended, long period of time. Um, Back in 2020 or 2021, Chichalu shared a recipe that we called Kalapuya tarts. and the idea was to actually put tarweed as a 1/3 replacement of flour and just make little tartlet cups and then put berries in them. And the substitute that I would roughly say for that is that if you don't have tarweed around, you can actually just use uh, sunflower seeds. They have to be whole. You can't use all that fiber. But if you just have normal, like sunflower seeds that you can buy at the store, it's actually a pretty similar taste profile. But it just adds, makes things nuttier, and yeah, it's tasty.
Awesome. Um, oh, keep
Uh,
going.
oh, I saw the picture of Mill Creek. And Mill Creek is a really big deal archaeological site, and Tom Connolly has wrapped up and provided a report for that, which is really spectacular. Now that he's retired, the report didn't actually get finished right after all the work had been done, and a number of people had retired and moved to different jobs. And so Tom, who for a long time was the head of research at University of Oregon. When he retired, he just knew how important this archaeological site was in Salem. And I-5, when it was renovated, was actually moved 150 meters because, or the original plans would have the expanded I-5 actually go through this archaeological site that's near the Salem airport. But this archaeological site had huge numbers of stone bowls and pestles, and it was a real prominent camas gathering site. But it's also believed to, have other botanical significance all around that area. And a part of it is that that area, and this is something kind of relevant to camas and other species, is that you have spaces where plants will grow, but then you have places where they're desirable for different reasons. And so camas will grow in not well drained soils and clay, but it's a lot easier to dig camas when it's in sandy soils. And the gravels and the lighter alluvial soils around Mill Creek supported camas populations that were then desirable because they were able to be dug. I think that the comparable that might be like worth an inquiry, and I don't have evidence for this, but with tarweed, this idea that you sort of need regular disturbance in order to ensure that it can continue to be in an early succession environment to be able to make it effective. And there's some soil types and others that when you burn them, they sort of respond well and allow you to reestablish. And then there's others where those perennial plants are going to hold on a lot better through a burn, and it'll be harder to establish your tarweed patches. And I think that those sorts of ideas of tarweed can grow in many places, but where is your most effective ability based on soil types and other functions if you're going to apply those cultural practices to try to manage tarweed patches or other actions, I think are curiosities. And I haven't thought about it specific to Mill Creek, but just to say it's an archaeology site that we haven't talked a whole lot about, but within the archaeological world, that's because there really weren't final reports out until recently, about 20 years after the bulk of the work was done.
I think the Mill Creek site is a great transition into the next slide if you're comfortable with that too. So I'm a paleoethnobotanist, and so my job title technically means that I'm supposed to think about how people engage with plants both in the past and how they do so today to try to make those connections. So I'm technically an archaeologist, but I'm also finding myself as an ethnobotanist too. So trying to combine both thinking about the past, but also plants. And so this slide really shows how we commonly isolate archaeological plant remains from sites via soil samples. And so the most common way that we have worked for the last 50 or so years as paleoethnobotanists is to collect a bulk soil sample. So the image on the top of your screen is just a feature from an archaeological site with lots of charcoal and charred plant remains. And so that process of charring actually converts organic carbon to inorganic carbon. If you've ever had a campfire and you woke up next day, it's kind of what's happening. And so we can take those sediment samples and soil samples and we actually put them in water. And so when you put it in water and you try to get the sediment into solution, all the carbonized material will actually float to the surface. So the next image down is a funky one. You can do this with a bucket, pretty cheap and low cost and really effective. You can also just buy a pump and set one up with a garbage can. It's really amazing. It does a fantastic job of really isolating your charred plant remains from archaeological sites. Once you've done that, we dry everything out and then we try to sort and try to identify some of the different plant remains. And so think about how hard it is to, if you're not trained to think about plants, to try to identify a plant in the field. Now imagine it's twisted and charred and black and you have half of it and you might have lost some of the texture too. So that's what we've really tried to do. That photo is actually from the 8,000-year-old Camas site farther to the south in the long-term drainage in the valley. And then finally, we actually just try to pull out and isolate archaeological seeds and other types of woody or larger remains themselves. Now, I have a great friend, Tom Connolly, who worked at the Mill Creek site, who has been very curious about tarweed through the years. And he's told me too that tarweed has been noticeably and suspiciously absent from the handful of paleoethnobotanical studies that have taken place within the valley. So on the next slide too, if it's okay to show the next one, I'm very excited about the potential for microbotanical techniques, which are relatively recent approaches to understanding people-plant relationships through time. So I have on the screen too, just an example of the groundstone materials from that Mill Creek site. So we can look at both starch granules. So some plants produce lots of starchy granules, just how they store their carbohydrates. And all plants, not all plants, but many plants also produce phytolith cells. So phytolith cells are silica cells, which help a plant to stand upright. But they're really fantastic too, because they really preserve a record of leaves and stems and even seeds. And so it's possible, and I'm hoping that people will be inspired to take up potentially the Mill Creek collection and other collections to sample some of this groundstone to really try to isolate and identify some of these other microbotanicals and really help to figure out where tarweed was through time. Now, there's been a little bit of work with the common sunflower, Helianthus, which doesn't really produce a lot of starch, but the family that tarweed is a part of does produce phytoliths, so it is possible. And we have yet to really try to isolate Medea as well to think about. And the next slide, I'm also frequently asked, where do we see tarweeds through time? Oh, could you actually skip to the next one and then I'll backtrack to the California example? Thanks. So, and again, I've been told too that, and I've in my own research really not been able to see many tarweed seeds in any of the paleoethnobotanical assemblages that we really have, which is really funny because it's very well established through contemporary practice and historic sources that the Willamette Valley at contact was a really complex mosaic of different plant communities. And so many of these were fire dependent. And again, these early successional plant communities that would have supported tarweed. So one of my favorite maps ever is this map that we have on the screen, which is where the researchers actually went to some of the old BLM records from the 1850s and some of those original survey notes and were able to reconstruct what the vegetation would have looked like at contact too. So we can kind of imagine just how different this place may have actually been. There's been some work to try to think about what landscapes might have really looked like in the past. Really quickly, there's actually been some really cool fire reconstructions at Beaver Lake, so just outside of Corvallis, that looked at charcoal influx rates, and they've argued that if we look at this charcoal within lake cores, really at about 4,000 years before present, we really see quite an increase in fire potentially, but that also, if we try to reconstruct vegetation using pollen, which is another common technique, that those vegetation communities from 4,000 years to present are relatively stable. So that really tells us that people are actually using fire to maintain these early succession communities for at least 4,000 years. Really incredible. But again, tarweed has been pretty suspiciously absent. So if we could just bounce back quickly to the California slide very quickly. I reached out to a good friend who just retired, Eric Wolgemuth, who has studied and analyzed archaeobotanical, paleoethnobotanical samples for his whole career throughout all of California. And so we're talking thousands and thousands of samples. And so he noted that tarweed isn't actually a major staple when compared to many of the other small seeded plants that he sees quite a bit of in those samples. So again, Clarkia is a big one, or goosefoot is another big one, and I'd be happy to talk for another hour about goosefoot someday, potentially. However, there are a couple sites that do have lots of tarweed, particularly in the Bay Area around Walnut Creek. There's one in San Diego County, and then a couple others too. He also thinks that we should see quite a bit more throughout Sacramento Valley as well, too, as an interesting comparison to the Willamette Valley, but just hasn't had the right places to really look at in that area. But Eric told me too that it's not that tarweed shouldn't be in archaeological sites, it's just that we're not probably looking in the right places. And so if we skip ahead 2 slides, and I can stop on my archaeology spiel in a moment as well, too. I've done some homework, and there is actually one known archaeological occurrence of tarweed. So this actually comes from excavations that were conducted by the University of Washington with the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde. And David, would you be able to introduce that particular field school briefly?
Yeah, here I've skipped. I'm apparently not doing technology well. Oh, what have I done? Oh, I have to ask for a request. Okay. Well, we're starting over, I guess, folks. Let's see, where were we? Can you see the whole thing? Yeah. Hey, okay. Are you looking at what we're hoping you're looking at?
Looks great.
Fabulous. Um, so this map is the first map of the Grand Round Indian Reservation. And we've overlaid the names. They just put there was a table off to the side of it, and the table has names of the different groups that were settled on the reservation. And while there is sensitive information on this map, I'm not too concerned about the sharing of it because it's not georeferenceable. This map, we have tried to bend it all different ways, and we spent a very long time. But the map more or less motivated us to host a 5-year Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeology field school at Grand Round. It was a point in time where there also a lot of larger universities in our region, their prominent field schools were sort of phasing out and those projects, and we realized there was really a need and a value to have that. But we also wanted to center the ways that we as tribal people look to use archaeology as a tool and a tool of empowerment of indigenous methodologies and ways of doing things. And this has been a really powerful tool. We've had a number of our own staff go through the program, but we've also had community members. One of those community members, Sarah McKenzie, now has her PhD, and she's back working in our community. Another one of our students graduated from OSU and is in a PhD program at Berkeley right now for archaeology. And it was a partnership with the University of Washington and Dr. Sarah Gonzalez, who is a wonderful partner to work with through the years. But we set out to try to make sense of, since we have regulatory responsibility for archaeology on our reservation, and the tribe does development projects throughout the reservation, to say, hey, there were these early encampments, and one of the big problems that we had on the reservation, first off, is around 500 people died in the first year of removal to the reservation. And one of the references in the Indian agent letters was there isn't going to be land to give to anyone because all the land has burials on it. because there was no centralized cemetery, and so all these people were being buried, what we believe likely around where their initial encampments were. And so this presented a regulatory hurdle and challenge for us, because as much as we do that work throughout our homelands to protect our ancestors' belongings and their grave sites, we also need to do that on the Grand Round Indian Reservation. And so, with the help of that field school, we sought out to identify these encampments. And through that process, there was some tarweed identified.
Yeah, so if the next slide's okay. So during those excavations, and I've spoken with Sarah Gonzalez and Ian Kretzler too, just to make sure it's okay to talk about this a little bit. But they shared that they used auger holes, so a very small, minimally invasive way of getting a quick peek underground. And so these augers, in a couple, I think about two of these augers, they found a total of 7 tarweed seeds within these particular excavations. And so all were pretty shallow, about 20 to 30 centimeters below the surface, which is pretty shallow within the region's archaeology. And they were all identified in association with acorn nutshells, berry seeds, as well as wheat seeds too. And so Ian Kretzler, in his writing, states that the presence of these food plants, including the tarweed, berries, and acorns, within 30 centimeters of the surface, as well as flaked vessel glass, really presents compelling evidence for continued native presence and manifestations of enduring connections with place and practice, which I find very powerful, thinking about how we create relationships with tarweed and how these relationships persist through time. David.
Yeah, so Ian was one of the individuals that received a PhD through leading and was one of Sarah's main assistants and teaching assistants as a part of this program. But yeah, we're immensely grateful for it, and it was sort of naturally coming to a close with where we were at with the work, and then the pandemic happened, so we just sort of stopped and transitioned into other work. But I was incredibly grateful, and it's had a real lasting impact. But to see that, evidence of that transition time, oftentimes tribal people get relegated only to the past and sepia tone images or black and white. It's hard for people to even think about Native people at present or Native people having a future. But the most challenging thing that I think people have is imagining that Native people also have a historic period. And a lot of the archaeology that we were looking at was very reflective of that, which is early reservation life, and where these traditional life ways are meeting up against, wheat germ showing up in things because the tribal people on the reservation are also growing wheat. And that sort of complexity of these two things going together. So that goes back to those things we've talked about in previous talks, right? We use the word traditional and ancestral in a way. And ancestral is the way that my ancestors did something, but traditional is the way that I might do something in honor or recognition of my ancestors, but allowing for change through time. So this idea of making tarweed tarts with wheat flour, maybe it's even more traditional than I'm giving it credit for, right? Because the second that people on the reservation had wheat, were they not integrating it with the tarweed that they had that was available to them? And are we finding archaeological expressions of that? Like, it's interesting.
Yeah, there's so much to think about and explore within this greater story. Would you share a little bit more about fire science and managed landscapes for us?
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I included 2 pictures. Uh, Fire is not just big forest fires, right? Like this fire that you're seeing up on the right. It's a little hot, but like you could walk through it. A little on the left might be a little hotter than I would want it to be, but on the right, you can really work in and adjacent to different fires and like understanding fire behavior, when really, if you haven't been in an environment or in a direct relationship with fire, I feel like we're all just sort of programmed to think of fire as catastrophic scale, catastrophic landscape level scale. And fire can do things like down here on the bottom where it doesn't even consume all of the plant parts when it goes through. And so I included this picture because you're seeing some resprouting after a fire, but also all those sticks that are there, um, it didn't get hot enough to kill the below ground portions of the plants. In this place, what it did is it did nutrient cycling, right? That essentially took the resources that were above ground and made them available to like be absorbed back into the ground. But it also leaves an environment where seeds can sprout. And the other thing about fire that I think is interesting with tarweed is that fire and all the winds that go off of it actually have the ability to also spread seed. So if the fire isn't hot enough to actually destroy the seed that's on the ground, you have this ability where it would throw it and move it around. The other thing that I think sometimes gets missed is that this ability to go in and harvest seed, then burn it, and then spread the seed afterwards, because tarweed is sprouting in the fall and then it's overwintering, and not all the plants survive. Oftentimes you'll even see frost damage on some of the plants in the spring, but then they shoot and they grow up in the spring itself. They're not holding over and waiting to sprout come springtime. They're actually sprouting in the fall. And so it has this ability to like cover the ground and take these other actions. And if you're going back to a patch and burning it regularly and taking these actions where you're spreading seed in that environment, like that patch is just going to be far, far more abundant. And it's interesting in those ethnographic early records that there's really two plants in the Willamette Valley that get called out as being like private property. Like most all things are sort of held in common by the people, and there's best practices and people like look after certain things. But tarweed and tobacco are the two plants that are like personal ownership. Like people have their own patches. Like you don't go into other people's patches. Like there's private ownership of these plant species. And we can ask those questions of why, but with tarweed, it feels like there's direct evidence and returns of you take action, right? You plan for it over the winter, you come back, and like, ideally, I'm imagining you're thinning that patch, you're doing these different things. And so, to go and take from somebody else's patch, you're sort of taking from their work without their permission. Um, would you add anything else about fire and managed landscapes? You gave a really great succession piece earlier.
I don't have much else to say, just that I mean, tobacco too really thrives with ash as well as part of the whole cultivation process. So, like you were saying, there's so much similar between these two species and how they were cultivated and cared for.
With it being this early succession plant too, and this is something that we talked about in the tea talk, there's some plants that are just abundant, right? And as a result, like the risk to ex like putting pressure on it and not making it available to other things. This idea that naturally when you harvest tarweed, you're spreading tons of tarweed seed anyways. There's no way you can like fully get all the tarweed seed. And so it's just one of those things that like talking about it or even encouraging people, like there was a talk in the chat of, hey, where can I buy tarweed seed? And I was like, really, you just need to keep a lookout for tarweed plants. And as they're progressively uh, flowering, you like look for a good time and go out there with a tennis racket and go knock off some seed for yourself and build your own little patch and grow it over time. I don't know of it being commercially available. There may be um there may be some around. I think that the whole heritage, there's a number of different nurseries that are sort of growing out for large restoration, and I'm not sure if it's really available to individual people to purchase. But really, I don't feel like it's irresponsible because it's just impossible to like remove a meaningful amount of seed that would be impactful to an ecosystem because it's just such an incredibly abundant plant. Um, yeah, plants of abundance.
And you mentioned too that
Mhm.
really quickly, because I know we're at time too, probably, but you mentioned too that to really grow tarweed as well, it really requires quite a bit of input, right?
Oh, like the thinning actions?
Yeah.
Or yeah. So that like time and energy that you're putting in, how I talked about, like you want optimal spacing so that the plants don't blow over, so that you're not getting pests and critters that are nesting in it. You're having to go back and check it throughout the season because as the flowers progressively bloom, which is great because it gives a long season of pollination, but there's going to be sort of a bulk when a majority of the seed pods are developed and the flowers have died that they've opened up. And if even a big wind goes through, it could blow all those seeds out. And so you're sort of keeping an eye as you're never going to get all the seeds on the plant. Like there's one specific time, but there's going to be a preferred period of time where like the bulk of the plants in a given area are mostly as available as they're going to be to gather seed from. Yeah. And Dave did a great job of talking about the Tarweed Awakening. But I just wanted to include three different pictures that kind of showed different activities that were happening from speaking to, Chris sharing about ash and other pieces of Tarweed. And I'm excited about what that's going to become over time as we kind of look at it and move forward. Um, oh, and thank you and citations. Some thank you for all those citations. I think this is our last slide, so I can leave it there while we kind of do question and answer. Does that sound good? Uh-oh. We'll see if I can not cut us off while I try to go to what I'm trying to get to. Okay. Got it. Technology. Um, Wonderful. Um, Apparently, there are pictures out of the bridge art. The bridge art is done. You can go to the bridge, you can see it. The bridge isn't done, but the bridge art is done. And I believe Dave Eckert has shared these with some other community members, and it's sort of out and about that bridge project. So this isn't that presentation, and I don't think we'll be able to fish them out in time to share them tonight. But go take a look yourself at the bridge to see those different pieces. Um, um, Thoughts on flame weeding. Um, there's some really cool stuff going on. One of our previous presenters, Joe Scott, who lives nearby over in Peoria, Joe, and there's a lot of cultural fireworks kind of happening in the valley. And one of the things that sort of gets brought up is that the go-to in the prescribed fire community is like drip torches, which is like gas and diesel fuel, and you're like pouring it out. And that seems okay when you're just sort of burning an environment. But if you're gonna like eat the plants that's the area and you're trying to have that relationship for a lot of years, people started to ask the question like, why are we pouring gasoline on to start our fires? And one thing that Joe has started to do, which is really great, is use fat wood and actually build these pitch stick holders that he uses elderberry shoots for. And he's able to soak the elderberry shoots so it's long, so you don't have to like scrouch down to the ground. And then you light the fat wood on fire, and as a composite tool, you stick it up in, and then you can walk along. He's also building these pine cone pitch bombs where he's like soaking pine cones into pitch and wrapping a metal wire around it that you can throw really far into the interior to light things off. And it's really cool. Alternatively, one thing that we do in a lot of our patches is we just use a propane torch to essentially do that. And I think that was the reference to flame weeding. There's also these elaborate like farm equipment flame machines that people have tried in different ways, and a lot of times the real challenge with that is that you just have soil moisture and you have all these other factors that really RH, relative humidity. There's just a lot of factors, and yeah, it's hard to control it the same way. Tarweed oil is sticky. We have some people who are confirming that. Prevention is no, just getting sticky. I have no tips and tricks for that. Maybe having a dedicated set of clothing that you use for the pitchiness, because you're gonna ruin whatever clothes or shoes they are. There's just no way around it. Um, Dr. David Craig has asked, what are the current questions that you think would make for a good master program? What are the most compelling questions? Master program. I don't know, Dave. We got to follow up about this. I don't quite understand the question. You know, Molly? Is this like OSU extension thing?
Do you mean for like a master's student potentially or master's project?
Oh.
Um, there's been a ton of work looking at like common sunflowers. And so I think thinking about the different ways that people have intentionally and unintentionally selected for different traits in sunflowers. So like the ones that you grow that have the giant big seed heads, like we've selected for that. Normally sunflowers are very branchy. Um, so I think that thinking through the different traits that ancestral Calipoian people might have been drawn to could be quite different to the ways that we think about selection and annuals for sunflowers and wheat and all of those other big annual grain type plants. So for me, I'd be really curious about what are some of those other traits then that we could really isolate and think a little bit more clearly about and how we could track that through time. I think genetically too, like there's so much we don't really know. And I'd really encourage others to consider exploring some of the genetic and phenotypic diversity. In fact, I have more questions about tarweed than I have answers. So I would encourage any master student to come hang out with us for a few hours, and we could certainly send you off in a direction. Actually, we'd have too many directions.
Cool. There's a question about, was it primarily used for food or anything else? Yes, here it was used as food. There are some references to indigenous people of Chile using the oil to actually like rub down their bodies, almost like as a part of like similar cleanliness rituals or other things like that. Otherwise, food and you know, general health, I guess, well-being. But I don't know, there really aren't any oil references that I'm familiar with, like from our use or utilization. I guess maybe we can make them up though. Maybe that's an indigenous futurism. I don't know, a took soap or something. I don't know, right? We use one of those words and do that. That'd be fun. Uh, Kalapuya isn't really an active spoken language. Basically, Jed Chirac is our linguist that works on Kalapuya. Jed has given some presentations in the past. He's an incredible, insightful, thoughtful person about how to talk about language and really complicated things. But listening to probably a couple of Jed's talks, if you're interested about pronunciation of Kalapuya words, is your best bet. Blessings to you for being interested in that, which is wonderful. There's not a lot of resources for it because there's not that many people that are actively interested and engaged in it. How are we doing? Seeds, recommendation about Small Island Seed Company. Apparently sells the seeds if you're looking for them. Somebody found that for us. Oh, David Craig asked me if I was going to do my master's, what would I do it in today? I'm not going to be getting my master's, but I appreciate that. Probably something to do with indigenous art. If I was gonna do a master's today, I'd completely transition and do like some sort of art history probably degree. Which I get to do those things. Great. Lahui, ancestral versus traditional. So Lahui, White Bear. Well, I'm hoping maybe I'll do a presentation next year. We got to talk to her about that. I really appreciate your framing of ancestral versus traditional and what that means for Native people in the present and even past. What advice do you have in helping prevent refusals of what is considered traditional food preparations based on conflations with ancestral? Let me see if I quite understand. Advice about helping prevent refusals. Oh, a part of this, I think of it as two parts of there's like a community itself who sort of like self-oppresses. So there's like a lot of shame through the process of like colonialism and like a lot of these things that have happened and felt like things have been taken. And so um, a lot of within our own communities, sometimes there's lateral oppression that when people seek to do something within food, there's this rigorous not enoughing or not the right way or sort of policing that happens. That's one way. But then there's also outside of the community where uh, sometimes you have non-tribal people who, when you decide to be your full tribal version of yourself because you get to be a living, breathing human, they try to like put you in a box and say you're not really Indian if you're not the way that I think Indian should be, which is this antiquated way that what my grandparents thought Indians were is like what you have to be. Those are really challenging things. And, the type of advice, or at least the way that I approach it, is just looking for that inspiration of Coyote. And in our creation stories, like Coyote is everything that is human, which is its flaws, its best, it's everything. It's not. I think that a lot of that shame or those other challenges that we sometimes face inside and outside of our community are based on these like false expectations of like duality, or like there's only two choices, there's only good and bad or evil or these other parts and not that like gray space. And our Coyote stories and other things like teach us that that really isn't the human way, and it's never really been the human way. Like there isn't as much clarity as we would like. It doesn't mean that there aren't truths. It doesn't mean that there isn't bullshit in the world, and bullshit's, pardon my language, like really problematic. And a lot of our stories talk about the consequences of when you don't aren't truth seeking, right? And doing that, and that there are universal truths in how the world works, but it's never as cut and dry and simple. And so now I've kind of got off into a full blown ramble, but I think that both of those things are just really important to acknowledge about tarweed, right? Tarweed's not an active thing that it's not like every family is at home in the community of Grand Round making tarweed for dinner tonight, right? Like that's not happening. It could in 50 years. I think the reason why we should think about it as a possibility is that it's an abundant thing of this place, and for all the efficiencies and the values and the nutrition that it has, like we should consider and know the things that are inherently abundant in this place. And the indigenous people who were here first, my ancestors, they knew about it, they really valued it, and maybe we'll either need to or want to value it the same in the future. Some wildlife. There's a question about wildlife relationships with tarweed. One of the big things that I would note is just an observation that yellow finches love to hang out in tarweed. So it's this really beautiful thing of like yellow flowers and yellow finches as birds. There's a lot of birds that use it, but I've noticed a lot of yellow finches like hanging out in that, and that sort of begs this other question where we talked about predators hanging out that are eating one thing, but also yellow finches. It's sort of like camouflage against the other things that might be trying to get the finches. So it's an interesting conversation. There's a reference or a desire to add Shalawa to the Chinnaquawa dictionary, but Shalawa isn't a Chinnaquawa word, so it probably wouldn't be added to the Chinnaquawa dictionary. It's a Kalapuya word, which is that challenge of many different languages, but a community that has connections to all those different languages. Slides available to registrants. So one thing that's really wonderful about this is this whole presentation goes up, the slides and the video of everything on YouTube after it's transcribed, and all the attendees that registered will get a link, so you'll be able to gain access, and it's up on the YouTube channel that the Corvallis-Benton County Library has. And one last question, and just a compliment. Thank you. Great. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to gather. Molly, I think you and I got to go to lunch and have some of these tarweed conversations further, and I'm excited that maybe we can get some grad students or others pushing the envelope and thinking. I'd love to see if we can't keep a lookout. Tom has been a great advocate, encouraging Tom Connolly to look for tarweed in archaeological sites. But maybe one of these days we're going to find a big treasure trove of ethnobotany in a Willamette Valley archaeology site that's preserved. I think we're all going to get pretty excited about that.
Yes, I think it'll come. I think we just got to look in the right places. But also, I'm really excited too, just to learn more about the plant and hear more about the tarweed awakening that'll be taking place in Corvallis too. So thank you for a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. And remember, August 22nd, we're going to have the Tarweed Awakening, and you'll see people that are on the screen right now there, plus a lot of other people, and we have more than double the number of programmatic co-sponsors for next year already. So it's going to be quite a different and more developed program. So thank you, David. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Bonnie. This has been wonderful. Again, tarweed.
Thanks, everyone. I'll sign us off for the evening. Thank you all for joining us.